Today I want to talk a little bit about the state of Europe. So, since I travel quite a lot and I have recently, over the last year or two, visited most of Northern Europe, I would say, I thought I'd give a bit of a rundown of what I saw and maybe focus on some key cities and describe my impression and give a bit of a comparison of the situation of Europe, in the 2016, 2017. Some of these cities I was in 2015, but all of them will have been, all of them within, let's say, the last 18 months. Well after, we have our initial, swarms of migrants in the summer of 2015 arriving in Europe. Now, I'm aware that obviously some of the places, especially Paris, are probably have disintegrated since, and so I won't speak about Paris much because I think the situation there is very in flux, and a lot of the sort of migrant camps around Calais and Dunkirk have been disintegrating or been closed, and there seems to be this bottleneck of people that want to reach the UK. So maybe take with a bit of a grain of salt what I say about Paris, because that's also a place that I haven't been in the last 12 months. Or I haven't spent much time, at least. But I have traveled extensively. So I think we'll start with the west and then go further east, roughly. So Dublin, Ireland, Ireland in general. So I found that Southern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, is probably one of the least multicultural places in Europe that I have visited. The difference between Northern Ireland and the Catholic Republic of Ireland in the south is quite pronounced. So while Dublin has many, Brazilian and Argentinian, Chilean, students trying to learn English, because I guess the cost of learning English in Ireland is cheaper than in the UK, and potentially the competition around getting visas is lower. So while you have that sort of strong English student element, in any other way the level of multiculturalism is much lower in Dublin than it is in Belfast. So I really noticed this. You go to Belfast, and it's the same situation you have anywhere in the United Kingdom. Very, very multicultural. A lot of Africans, a lot of Arabs, a lot of subcontinental Asians, as in Indians, Bangladeshis, etc. And it was quite interesting for me to go, from Dublin. It's quite close. You can drive it in 2 hours or so. 3 hours maybe, and just see how pronounced the difference is. So in Dublin, there's obviously a bit of a tourism, some tourism happening, and you have lots of Europeans and Americans as well. There's a lot of Americans with Irish heritage visiting Ireland at any given time. But it is certainly, on a European comparison, one of the least multicultural countries that exists still, and it also is one of the countries where I believe the traditional European sort of folk and music and community and sort of just the Irish way of life still persists quite strongly. Something that you really wouldn't find in Germany, or at least northern Germany, or England to that degree, or even Holland. I would say the sort of strong presence of traditional music and habits and customs. So then moving on, Scotland. I did not spend much time in Glasgow, but Glasgow certainly strikes me as, and this, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it certainly strikes me as more multicultural than Edinburgh, and this may simply be cost. This might simply be, Edinburgh, I believe, is a little bit more expensive. But again, compared to England, Scotland is not in any way a very multicultural place at this point in time. Although, and certainly in the countryside, I think you still have very, a very traditional European place. However, the government, obviously, the sort of SNP, I believe they're called, is your typical socialist, multicultural, virtue signaling kind of Eurocrats in a way. And so a lot of this sort of SNP bluster, this sort of secessionist anti-English bluster is, I mean, it's just using historical tensions for ill purposes. I mean, and again, it'd be great if someone in the comments can actually tell me about what's actually going on there a bit more. But my impression was that the SNP is certainly not an anti-immigration party. So the sort of breakaway from England has got nothing to do with the multiculturalism of England that they're resisting. It's a more sort of governmental welfare state, socialism, anti-Tory kind of stance. But certainly Scotland struck me as quite similar to Ireland. No, not in any way like England. England, on the other hand, is probably one of the most multicultural places in Europe. And this does not only go for London, this also goes for Birmingham, Leeds, even some of the smaller places. I mean, some of the medium-sized cities are just, I mean, you walk through these beautiful, beautiful, quaint old towns, and really all you encounter is, Afghan migrants just hanging around, doing nothing. I mean, it is quite an odd picture, to sort of have these quaint towns with this totally at odds population basically being the street picture. Yeah, so I think in many English towns now, and this is not only London, there's Birmingham, Leeds, Manchester, etc., you have English people or British people in general, I mean, there's some Scottish and Welsh people obviously moved there, in the minority. I think it's very clear. I mean, the statistics themselves claim that it's roughly 50-50, but I think the statistics are wrong, and the number of migrants far surpasses what the official statistics claim. And I actually have some anecdotal sort of evidence about this. So one of the techniques many migrants use is the European Union, and I think many Brits are aware of this. So, potentially people from Tunisia or Algeria or Libya will buy a Portuguese or Spanish passport and therefore obtain the right to just stay in England indefinitely. Legally, essentially, although obviously buying the passport's not legal, but yeah, so they would obviously count as just Europeans, but they're not. And I think there's millions of people like this. I think there's a real industry around this. Certainly London is no longer really recognizable as a British city. And this is not only due to Middle Eastern migrants. I mean, there's vast numbers of Greeks, Italians, Spanish, Portuguese, Polish, Bulgarians, Romanians in London. So, you know, I mean, England is. I mean, I wouldn't. I mean, I'd say certainly when it comes to London, the culture is very strong. I mean, the British history and the culture. I mean, it's all across the architecture, right? I mean, the traditions, whether it's theatre or I mean, even just some of the 60s and 70s alternate rock or the monarchy or the pubs. I mean, English culture is strong. There's no two ways about it. So I don't see it necessarily dying at the moment, the way you might sort of see that death in Germany potentially, but it's certainly being altered irreversibly, and then there's this attrition. And in London, you really have a strong segregation. So um, you have East London and many areas, I mean, with almost no white people at all anymore. And also in the south in Brixton, I mean, some of the hotspots would be, Tower Hamlets, Tottenham, Brixton, and I mean the list goes on and on. And obviously, if you have some more information and data on this, Luton is another place, for example. Please comment in the comments below. So yeah, I mean, I think that's well known what the situation is in London and in the UK and in England, at least especially. Wales, I spent some time in Wales. I did not spend much time in Cardiff, or any time really, so I cannot comment on Cardiff. But the rest of Wales is obviously nowhere near. I think it's probably one of the least multicultural places in Europe as well. Probably even less multicultural than Ireland, but that's due to just a general level of very low level of population. And when we speak about people living there, well, Wales is really just the tourist drive away from England. So while I was in Wales, I mean, you have lots and lots of tourists essentially in burqas. I mean, this is the crazy thing. You're sightseeing, and to the left and right of you, there's dozens of people, Muslims who are British, hold a British passport, also sightseeing in Wales. They may not live in Wales, they probably live in Birmingham or Manchester. They only drive an hour, and that's their sort of weekend trip as well. So it's quite a bizarre, kind of image sometimes. But yeah, moving on, Brussels, so Belgium. I mean, Brussels is quite similar to London. You have the big difference between the British Isles and the continent, I believe, is the level of integration, or the sort of level of harmony, I suppose, between the migrants and the native population. So I suppose the Brits are really quite tolerant, and I suppose many of the migrant communities there have been there for a very long time, and they also come from places like Bangladesh often, or India, which have a very different sort of culture to, say, maybe Syrians or Somalis, right? So I would argue that by and large the tensions between migrants and natives are stronger on the continent than they are on the British Isles. And this is, I think that this is a whole new video, but that doesn't mean they don't exist in the UK. I think they do exist, and certainly the Arab communities in sort of northern England have obviously fallen into a lot of disrepute with these sort of the Rotherham rape groups and these sort of issues. And then they also have sort of these jihadi, Salafi kind of, demonstrations, and which then often get, kind of broken up by other Muslims, like Kurds or Shia or whatever. So, um, but yeah, I mean, I just want to give a general overview. I don't want to get into too much detail. So Brussels, yeah, I mean, many Africans. I'd put the number at probably 35%, roughly, for migrants in Brussels. Paris, I said I'm going to skip. So let's move on to Berlin. Berlin, oh, well, that's generally, I think the numbers of, at least historically, the numbers of African or sort of Indian or subcontinental migrants in Germany was quite low. I mean, the visible group of foreigners was the Turks, historically, and then in Berlin, in Kreuzberg, this was extremely obvious. But obviously, the picture in Berlin has changed a lot. I would say there's a lot of Eastern Europeans in Berlin. There's a lot of Greeks, Italians, Gypsies, Romanians. And obviously now there's an ever-increasing Arab and also African community there. All the drug dealers in Berlin seem to be African, if you go to Kreuzberg. If I was to put some numbers on it, it's quite hard. Berlin has this large size to it. I mean, you have to remember that I believe it still hasn't recuperated the population numbers that it had before the Second World War. So in other words, it has still got less people than in 1933. So this just shows to you how utterly the place was bombed out. But I think they're approaching similar numbers now. But obviously, there's been a very large stream of German migrants to Berlin, as it has become the capital again. So, I mean, I'd put the level of foreigners at maybe 25% in Berlin, maybe 20. It certainly is nowhere near as multicultural. Certainly nowhere near as integrated from a multicultural aspect as much of London or Paris. But I think it's a place that's changing rapidly, and Germany is changing rapidly. So that's all I'm going to say about Berlin. Frankfurt really is the key place in Europe to watch for just its nature as a sort of key trading and transport and finance hub. It's got a lot of expats, obviously Americans, Belgians, people from all over Europe. But the thing that strikes me about Frankfurt is the situation at the station. So this is really where at the main train station, this is really where the difference between London and Germany becomes clear, is that, well, and this is integration. I mean, there's no two ways about it. Migrants do integrate into British society easier. I know there's people that think that's negative. I know there's people that think that's positive. But this is just the fact. So people do consider themselves, sort of British nationals, even if they're not ethnically Britons or Anglo-Saxons. Much easier, I believe, than people consider themselves German nationals when they're foreigners. So you have much more tension in Germany, and I think, as I was alluding to earlier, you also have a different type of migrant. I mean, it's much harder for criminals to actually make it into the UK than it is to make it to Frankfurt. I mean, you just drive, there's no borders, right? So the vibe at German train stations is a lot darker, a lot more dangerous, and a lot more aggressive than it is in the UK. And this is 100% down to roaming groups of foreigners, and they're not all non-Europeans. I mean, some of them are Albanians or Bulgarians, I get the sense. Many of them are Turkish, Arab, North African. And there's literally, there's literally a sense of danger past a certain hour. The Historically, Germany's obviously got some issues with surveillance and sort of the police state problems that were perceived during the Third Reich. So the level of CCTV and the level of policing is much lower as well in Germany than it is in the UK. So you certainly feel endangered in German train stations, certainly after dark. And there's groups of there's often when you get onto the train, there's sort of this, the train takes off, and on the way to the next station, there's this sort of announcement that there's a gang going through the train, and to hide all your wallets and belongings and not, avoid them essentially. I mean, it's kind of crazy, but that literally happened, and I witnessed this. So, traveling through there, yeah. So then moving on to the north, Copenhagen. Again, I would say Copenhagen. I mean, Denmark has a totally different policy than Sweden or even Norway. So Copenhagen is nowhere near as visibly multicultural as, as, for example, Gothenburg, but or Malmo. But it doesn't mean that those communities don't exist. There are, sort of to the northwest, roughly, of the sort of main old city, there are large Turkish and Arab neighborhoods. But there's, similar to London in a way, there's a bit of a segregation in the city, and this is something you don't really have in Germany as much, where the center of the city in Germany is often where a lot of the foreigners hang around, whereas in London, they sort of have their own neighborhoods, and the same goes for Paris, actually. In Paris, they're sort of excluded from some of the wealthiest central, historical districts. Copenhagen is the same. Although not completely. My guess of percentage in Denmark would be, something like 18 to 20%, maybe foreigners in Copenhagen. And this is not for Denmark as a whole. This is just Copenhagen. Certainly in the countryside in Denmark, you have fewer sort of foreigners than you would notice in, I don't know, in England, for example. Then moving on to Sweden. So I actually avoided Malmo. I drove through. But yeah, even just on the drive through, I mean, the situation is obvious. I did stop in Gothenburg, and I mean, there's clearly in the city at any given time, in a city in Gothenburg, there's a sort of nice, there's more foreigners than Swedes. I mean, 100%, especially in the sort of shopping center areas, they sort of tend to hang around that. Now, this might just be because they're not working, they're just hanging around town, whereas the Swedes are in actual buildings, they're not as visible. But I was quite shocked because Gothenburg's not the capital as well. It's a sort of, it's not even a major city, and I mean, I was just like, people will like, you kind of play spot the Swede, and this is not a joke, So whatever's going on in Sweden, that's a concerning situation. Moving on to Oslo. On Oslo, it's quite interesting. You have just a clear sort of distinction between East and West Oslo. So, yeah, I mean, I think the Oslo doesn't have this sort of core the way that Gothenburg has. I mean, it has sort of several neighborhoods that have, some interesting restaurants and sort of it's just a larger city than Gothenburg. So well, or let's put it this way, the old parts of it are larger. So the central east, east from the train station to basically to the highway sort of bridges there. That area is extremely multicultural. I mean, I would say it's that those neighborhoods are up 70, 60, 70, 80% Muslim or African. But it's very localized to that area. If you go to, the outskirts of Oslo or northern or western Oslo, I mean, it's pretty 100% Norwegian. I mean, there's other sort of expats. There's the American embassy, the Russian embassy, etc. So that you'll have sort of individual small families because it's the capital of the country, and obviously there's a large oil industry there, etc. But and in terms of sort of permanent immigrant communities, they are certainly focused in just east of the central station, north of the sort of new riverfront district there. And I mean, it's very high concentration, extremely high concentration. So, obviously there's not many Norwegians. It's not very hard to displace the Norwegians. I mean, you just 0.001% of India would totally wipe out Norway, right? So, as for the rest of the country, there's obviously in summer there's a permanent because of it being such a tourist destination. There's a permanent sort of kind of activity of foreigners like tourists from the rest of Europe and then also Americans and so on. So on the streets, in the countryside and in Bergen and so on. But the cities, yeah, I mean, you do have. I can't speak to all of them because I didn't visit everywhere, but you certainly do have migrants in Bergen, Stavanger, etc. as well. But I would say the percentage is lower. It's very hard to give estimates, but Oslo street picture is probably 40%. Now, that's probably not the actual population numbers, but if you as a tourist were to visit Oslo, you would say, oh yeah, it's 40% foreigners here. Just because of where the sites are and where the the way it appears. Now I can add some interesting Eastern European cities as well, so Krakow or Budapest or Prague. But as you can suspect, I mean, the only foreigners you're going to see there are, well, I mean, in Budapest, there's maybe some, kind of stranded migrants, but generally in Krakow, Budapest, or Prague, all foreigners are Western European tourists. There's surprisingly many Spanish, surprisingly many Italians, especially in Prague and Budapest. Obviously, there's quite a number of Americans as well. But the numbers of African or Asian or Middle Eastern migrants to those three countries is minimal. The same does not, and the same goes for Bratislava, by the way. And it's quite interesting to see that difference between Bratislava and Vienna, for example. Although Vienna, Austria is certainly nowhere near. I would put the numbers at maybe 15 to 20% for Vienna. But yeah, so if you want to do a ranking, Sweden and England right at the top, Belgium, France as well, and then Germany sort of underneath that, along with Norway and Denmark, and then the Eastern European countries come after that. So let me know in the comments if I've got anything wrong or if you agree with my impressions. Where this is going from here, we don't know. But I think the trajectory is clear that the majority of capital cities, at least in Europe, will have native minorities in not too long a time. So yeah, thanks for watching, and speak to you soon.